Dakota Territory, October 1873. The wind across the prairie had no manners. It was a bully, shoving its way through the cottonwoods along the creek bed and scouring the newly turned earth of the homesteads. It carried the scent of dust, curing grass, and a future cold that was less a promise and more a threat. Most settlers were racing against that threat, their days a frantic symphony of axes ringing against logs and the rhythmic rasp of saws. They were building up, erecting walls against the sky, creating boxes of warm air to defy the coming winter, all except Anja Vogel. Where others built up, Anja dug down. Her husband Klaus, a man whose quiet nature was often mistaken for weakness, hauled away earth in a wheelbarrow, his face a mask of worried determination. But it was Anja, a woman of 30 with hands more accustomed to a butter churn than a shovel, who directed the work with an unnerving calm. She wasn't building a cabin. She was carving a wound into the base of a low, south-facing limestone bluff that marked the edge of their claim. Silas Croft, a man who had built 3 army forts and a dozen homestead cabins, stopped his wagon on the rise overlooking the Vogel plot. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "What in God's name is that woman doing?" he muttered to his horse. From his vantage point, it looked less like the foundation of a home and more like the beginnings of a grave. It was an act of profound foolishness, an open invitation to the very cold she should be fighting. The sight was so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to every principle of sound construction he had ever known, that it offended him. He had seen greenhorns make mistakes, building too close to the creek, using green wood that would shrink and warp, but he had never seen anyone try to live in a hole in the ground. It was madness. The whispers in the fledgling settlement of Prairie Ridge started within days. Anja Vogel wasn't just unconventional. She was seen as touched by a prairie madness, digging a den for her family like a badger. Her 2 children, 8-year-old Liesel and 6-year-old Emil, played near the growing pile of excavated earth, oblivious to the stares and murmurs of their neighbors. Anja, however, was not. She felt the eyes on her back as she swung the pickaxe, the blade striking sparks against hidden stones. She heard the silence that fell when she entered the general store. But Anja wasn't building from fear or madness. She was building from memory. And when the great Dakota winter finally arrived, a winter that would be spoken of for generations, her strange, earthen hollow would not just be a shelter, it would be a revelation, proving that the deepest warmth wasn't found in fighting the cold, but in embracing the earth itself. The difference would be measured in degrees, in cords of wood, and in the quiet survival of her family. If you're fascinated by the kind of forgotten wisdom that allowed people to thrive in impossible conditions, subscribe to our channel. We uncover one of these lost techniques every week, showing how old knowledge often contains the seeds of modern resilience. The mockery began as a low hum of curiosity and quickly escalated into a chorus of public ridicule. Anja's project violated the visual language of survival on the prairie. A home was a fortress, a wooden bastion against the horizontal world of wind and snow. It had 4 walls, a steep roof to shed the drifts, and a proud plume of smoke from a stone chimney. It was a statement of human defiance. Anja's hole in the ground was seen as an act of surrender. Silas Croft, the experienced builder, felt a civic duty to intervene. He rode his horse down to their claim one afternoon, dismounting with the stiff authority of a man accustomed to being heard. Klaus met him, wiping his hands on his trousers, but it was Anja who emerged from the excavation, her face smudged with dirt, her gaze steady. "Ma'am," Croft began, skipping the pleasantries, "I've built more cabins than I can count, from the Platte River to the Canadian border. I know this land. I know the cold that's coming for it." He gestured with a thick finger toward the deepening hollow. A structure needs to be raised off the ground to stay dry. It needs 4 walls to brace against the wind. What you're building here, it'll be a cellar. It'll fill with damp, draw the frost, and become a tomb of ice by January. His concern was genuine, rooted in the hard-won experience of a dozen brutal winters. He saw a fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy. The cold came from the frozen ground just as much as it came from the air. Anja simply nodded, listening patiently. "In my home, in the high valleys of Switzerland," she said, her English precise but accented, "the cattle are warmer in the stone barns built into the hillside than the master is in his wooden house. The earth has its own warmth." Croft shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "This isn't the Alps, ma'am. This is the Dakota Prairie. The earth here freezes 5 feet deep. There is no warmth to be had from it." He had laid foundations. He knew the iron-hard reality of the winter soil. His logic was sound, his experience undeniable. He left them that day convinced he had warned a family marching toward disaster. The community voice belonged to Jedediah Kane, a farmer with a booming laugh and a love for storytelling. At the general store, leaning against a barrel of crackers, he found his stage. Heard about the Vogels? He'd ask anyone who would listen. "They're not building a soddy, no, sir. They're practicing to be gophers. Anja is digging the main tunnel, and Klaus is pushing the dirt out behind him." The men would laugh, slapping their knees. The name stuck. From that day on, the Vogel homestead was known as the Gopher Hole. The name was cruel, but it perfectly captured the community's perception. They were burrowing, hiding, behaving like animals, not proud settlers. The social pressure fell hardest on Klaus. He was a good man, a hard worker, but he felt the sting of the community's judgment. The most painful blow came from his own blood. His brother, Marcus, came to visit from a more established town, 60 miles to the east. Marcus was a merchant, a man who wore a starched collar and valued appearances. He stood beside the excavation, his polished boots collecting a fine layer of dust, and his face was a portrait of dismay and embarrassment. Later that evening, in their temporary tent, Marcus spoke to Klaus, his voice low and urgent. "Brother, what is this? People will think you cannot provide a proper home for your family. This is not a house. It's a den. You know what this looks like? It looks like you have failed." The words, meant as fraternal concern, were sharper than any stranger's mockery. That night, the weight was heavy in their small tent. "It is hard to be the town story," Klaus admitted to Anja, his back to her. He wasn't questioning her knowledge, but he was buckling under the load of their isolation. Anja came and sat beside him, taking his calloused hand. She didn't offer false reassurances. She offered a truth he could hold on to, a principle that was the bedrock of her conviction. "Klaus," she said softly, "their houses are built to fight the wind. Ours is built so the wind cannot find us. The earth does not feel the wind. We will not feel it either." It was her signature line, a piece of physics made poetic. It reframed the entire struggle. They weren't hiding. They were being clever. He turned and looked at her, at the unshakable certainty in her eyes, and his own resolve hardened. Winter would tell them what was wise and what was foolish. The work continued. As the first snows dusted the prairie, the Vogels' neighbors were chinking the gaps in their log walls with a mixture of mud and grass, their cabins standing as proud, finished symbols of readiness. At the Vogel claim, there was still just a strange, deep trench against a rock face, a gaping mouth waiting to be covered. The mockery lasted for 2 full months. The validation would last for 100 winters. The design of Vogel's burrow was a masterclass in thermal dynamics, born from generations of Alpine observation. It was not a primitive dugout, but a precisely engineered system designed to capture and store energy. Anja was not merely digging a hole, She was partnering with the planet's most powerful heat sink, the Earth itself. The first step was the excavation. Anja insisted they dig down 4 feet below the prairie grade, creating a sunken floor. This was the first principle: get below the frost line. While Silas Croft was correct that the topsoil would freeze into a block of iron, the deep earth beneath it held a stable year-round temperature. In that region, the ground temperature 4 to 5 feet down remained a constant 45 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of the season. It wasn't warm, but it was a world away from the deadly sub-zero temperatures that the air would soon hold. The excavated earth, a rich black soil, was carefully piled to the side, not discarded. The back wall of the structure was the limestone bluff itself. This was the second principle: borrow thermal mass. The south-facing rock wall absorbed solar radiation all day long, even on the weekdays of winter. After sunset, it would slowly radiate that stored warmth back into the dwelling. It was a passive solar collector, a massive freestone battery that worked tirelessly day and night. Anja had Klaus chisel channels into the rock, not for decoration, but to increase the surface area, allowing it to absorb and release heat more efficiently. For the front-facing wall and the 2 sides, they used the thickest cottonwood logs they could find, set vertically and half buried in the earth. The front wall was only 5 feet high from the sunken floor to the roofline, minimizing its exposure to the brutal northwesterly winds. It featured 2 small, well-sealed windows, no larger than 2 feet by 2 feet, to let in light without sacrificing heat. Anja insisted they be double-paned, a rarity on the frontier. She created the effect herself, using 2 carefully saved panes of glass for each window, with a 1-inch sealed air gap between them. This created a pocket of dead air, a surprisingly effective insulator. The roof was the most critical component. It was not a steep A-frame designed to shed snow, but a low-angled lean-to. Massive cottonwood beams, a full 12 inches in diameter, were set into the limestone bluff at the back and rested on the log front wall, creating a gentle slope. On top of these beams, they laid a deck of smaller, tightly fitted logs. The next layer was Anja's innovation, a detail that baffled onlookers. She laid down a layer of oiled canvas, a large sail she had purchased at a river town, making the roof waterproof. This was the key to defeating the dampness that Silas Croft had predicted. Then came the final, most important layer. Using the soil they had first excavated, Anja directed Klaus to cover the entire roof with a thick blanket of prairie sod. Not a decorative layer, but a full 18 inches of densely packed earth and grass roots. This was the third and most powerful principle: insulation and thermal inertia. The sod roof, weighing several tons, had incredible insulating properties, with an R value far exceeding that of a simple wooden roof. More importantly, like the stone wall, it possessed immense thermal mass. It would take days of sustained bitter cold for the frost to even begin to penetrate the outer layers of that earthen blanket. The house was now wrapped in the earth on 3.5 sides. The final piece of the puzzle was the hearth and chimney. A typical frontier fireplace was a massive, inefficient beast that consumed vast amounts of wood. Much of its heat went straight up the chimney, and to feed its voracious appetite for oxygen, it sucked in cold air through every crack and gap in the cabin, creating chilly drafts. Anja's design was different. She built a smaller, deeper firebox, lined with soapstone she had found by the creek. Soapstone heats up quickly and radiates warmth slowly and evenly. The chimney was not a towering stone column, but a smaller flue that ran up the face of the limestone bluff. The genius was in its placement. The entire mass of the chimney was inside the thermal envelope of the house, meaning all the heat radiating from its stones stayed within the living space. The cost of the materials was a fraction of a traditional log cabin. They used fewer logs, which were scarce on the prairie, and the most expensive item was the glass and the canvas sail. The cost in labor, however, was immense. They worked from sunrise to sunset for 2 months. One crisp November afternoon, as Klaus was packing the final layer of sod onto the roof, Anja stood inside the half-darkened space. The air was still and cool, smelling of earth and raw wood. It did not feel like a house. It felt like a cave, a sanctuary. Klaus came inside, stamping the chill from his boots. He looked around the strange, low-ceilinged room. Anja lit a small candle and placed it on the floor. In a normal cabin, the flame would have flickered and danced, revealing the dozen small drafts that were the enemy of warmth. Here, the flame stood perfectly still, a tiny, unwavering spear of light. "The problem is not the cold," Anja explained, though she was speaking as much to herself as to him. "The problem is the wind. The wind is a thief. It steals the heat from the walls, from the roof, from your very skin. We have not built a house. We have built a place where the wind cannot enter." This was the reframing insight. Her neighbors saw the cold as a pervasive force to be battled with a bigger fire. Anja saw the wind as the primary mechanism of heat loss, and she had designed a structure that was aerodynamically invisible to it. Her fire wouldn't have to fight the entire Dakota Territory. It only had to warm the still, trapped air within their earthen walls. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin during the worst blizzard in living memory would change everything for the people of Prairie Ridge. The winter of 1873 to 74 did not arrive gently. It descended like a hammer blow in late December, a blizzard that the Lakota would later call the Winter of the Great White Death. It began with a deceptive mildness, a thaw that melted the early snow. Then, the temperature plummeted. In the span of 6 hours, it dropped 50 degrees. The wind, a steady gale from the northwest, picked up the new-fallen snow and hurled it across the plains, creating a whiteout so complete that a man could get lost walking from his cabin to his barn. The temperature settled at a merciless minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, but with the wind, the effective temperature was closer to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. For the settlers in their proud log cabins, the battle for survival began. If you believe this kind of ingenuity deserves to be remembered, take a moment to like this video. It helps us reach more people with these incredible stories of resilience. The narrative splits here, cross-cutting between the desperate struggle in the conventional cabins and the profound, almost unbelievable calm in Vogel's burrow. Inside Silas Croft's cabin, a structure he had built himself, the finest in the settlement, with hand-hewn, perfectly notched logs, a war was being waged. His great stone fireplace, the pride of his home, was consuming wood at a terrifying rate. Every hour, his wife or his teenage son had to bundle up and face the blinding storm to bring in another armload from their rapidly dwindling woodpile. Despite the roaring fire, the corners of the main room were frigid. A bucket of water placed 15 feet from the hearth had a thick layer of ice on it. The wind, that relentless thief, was forcing its way through the smallest gaps in the chinking, creating insidious drafts that snaked across the floor. The difference between the heat near the fire and the cold in the rest of the room wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. They were living in a 10-foot circle of survivable warmth, while the rest of their well-built home had surrendered to the cold. The temperature inside, away from the fire, was a mere 38 degrees Fahrenheit. At Jedediah Kane's homestead, the situation was more desperate. His cabin was smaller, built with less precision. The wind didn't just find gaps, it howled through them. They had hung blankets over the doors and windows. But it was not enough. To feed their smaller, less efficient fireplace, They were burning through their wood at a rate that promised they would run out in 3 days. By the second night of the storm, they had retreated to a single room. The gut-punch detail of their hardship was not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet act of desperation. Jedediah's wife, Mary, owned a beautiful butter churn, a piece of home she had brought all the way from Ohio, made of polished maple by her father. As the fire died down and the killing cold began to seep into the room, Jedediah took his axe, and with his wife's silent, tearful blessing, he broke the churn apart. They fed the pieces of her last connection to her old life into the fire, buying themselves another 2 hours of warmth. Meanwhile, inside the Gopher Hole, a different reality was unfolding. The storm that raged outside was reduced to a muffled whisper. There was no wind inside because there was no way for it to get in. The 18 inches of sod and earth on the roof, now covered by a 4-foot drift of insulating snow, created a barrier that was nearly impervious to the cold. The limestone back wall, having absorbed the sun's energy for months, was slowly leaking a gentle, radiant heat into the room. Their small, efficient soapstone hearth glowed with a modest fire. Anja had calculated their wood needs carefully. They were using less than a quarter of the wood that Silas Croft was burning. The proof of her success was in the simple domesticity of the scene. Klaus sat at a small table, mending a piece of harness. Liesel and Emil, the 2 children, were on a blanket on the floor, reading a book together in their shirt sleeves. Their breath didn't fog in the air. A pail of water near the front wall was cool to the touch, but completely liquid. This was the children test, the ultimate proof. They were not just surviving, they were comfortable, living a normal life while a historic blizzard raged just inches above their heads. Anja, using a small mercury and glass thermometer she had brought from the old country, measured the temperature in the center of the room. It was 69 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference between their home and Silas Croft's wasn't marginal. It was a chasm. 69 degrees Fahrenheit versus 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. On the 3rd day of the storm, a crisis occurred at the Croft homestead. The extreme, rapid heating and cooling cycle had caused the mortar in his chimney to crack. A plume of smoke began to leak into the cabin, a dangerous, choking hazard that forced them to smother the fire. Now, without their primary source of heat, the 38 degrees Fahrenheit in the cabin began to drop, fast. Staring into the faces of his shivering wife and son, Silas Croft, the expert builder, the man who had pitied the foolish woman digging a hole, was forced to make a decision. His pride was a poor shield against a killing cold. A figure, bundled beyond recognition, materialized out of the white chaos and hammered on the thick wooden door of the Vogel's home. Klaus opened it, and Silas Croft, his beard caked with ice, stumbled inside. He was hit not by a blast of scorching heat, but by a wall of steady, enveloping warmth. It was like stepping into a different season. The air was still and quiet. He blinked, his eyes adjusting to the soft lamplight, and the first thing he saw were the 2 children, looking up at him with placid curiosity, their bare arms visible. The sight was so jarring, so contrary to the frozen hell he had just left, that he was speechless. He unwrapped the scarf from his face, his eyes darting around the low-ceilinged room, taking in the stone wall, the gentle fire, the utter lack of any discernible draft. He pulled a small brass thermometer from his coat pocket, the same type Anja used. He didn't ask permission. He walked to the center of the room and hung it on a wooden peg. Then he stood there, silent, his back to the Vogels, and watched it. He watched the mercury climb, past 40, past 50, past 60, until it settled, unwavering. He stared at it for a full minute. Then he turned, his face a mixture of exhaustion, disbelief, and dawning, shattering humility. He looked at Anja, then at Klaus. He opened his mouth, but no apology came out. Instead, his response was that of a craftsman, an engineer, defeated by a superior design. He remained silent for a long moment, the silence of a man whose entire worldview had just been dismantled. Then he looked at Anja, not with pity, but with a deep, urgent respect. "Show me how you built it." When the great blizzard finally broke after 4 days, the prairie was a transformed world, a landscape of immense rolling drifts and profound silence. The settlers of Prairie Ridge emerged from their cabins, blinking in the bright sun, to count the cost. No one had died, but the toll was heavy. Livestock had perished. Frostbite was common, and nearly every family had burned through a dangerous amount of their winter wood supply, with 2 long months of cold still to come. The first story to spread through the settlement was that of Silas Croft and his family taking shelter with the Vogels. It was told in hushed, incredulous tones. When Croft himself confirmed it, the community's perception of Anja Vogel shifted overnight. Mockery cannot survive in the face of undeniable proof. The man who had been her most vocal, expert critic now became her most powerful advocate. He didn't make grand speeches. His validation was quieter and far more potent. At the next gathering at the general store, Jedediah Kane, the man who had coined the name the Gopher Hole, tried to make a joke of it. Silas Croft, standing by the stove, fixed him with a cold stare. "Jedediah," he said, his voice low and carrying across the room, "that hole was 70 degrees when my own house, the best-built cabin in this county, was freezing over. I measured it twice. Her fire breathes from the outside. Our fires breathe from the inside, stealing our own warmth. We've been doing it wrong." A stunned silence fell over the room. It was a public admission of error from the most respected builder among them. The vindication was absolute. The name Gopher Hole was never spoken in mockery again. Within a year, people began to refer to the design by a new name, the Vogel Bluff House. That spring, a remarkable sight unfolded. Silas Croft, the master of log construction, was seen with a shovel and pickaxe, helping a newly arrived family excavate a site at the base of the same limestone bluff, a quarter-mile down from Anja's home. He wasn't just copying her design. He was teaching it, explaining the principles of thermal mass and wind protection he had learned during his enforced stay. He brought his carpenters square and level, applying his precision to Anja's earthen principles. By the first snow of 1874, 3 more bluff houses were completed, their sod roofs greening in the autumn sun. The innovation spread not through a dramatic revolution, but through the quiet, practical decisions of families who simply wanted to be warmer while using less wood. Within 5 years, more than a dozen such structures dotted the landscape along the creek and its bluffs. They became a unique architectural signature of the region, a testament to a community's ability to learn and adapt. The knowledge didn't supplant traditional cabins. People still preferred to build up in the open. But it provided a critical, life-saving option for those with the right piece of land. Anja and Klaus never sought recognition. They lived in their warm, comfortable home, raising their children, content in their quiet vindication. Anja's genius was not in inventing something new, but in remembering something old and seeing how it applied to a new world. She understood that the prairie's greatest challenges, the wind and the cold, were also its greatest assets, if you knew how to use them. The wind created the drifts that added insulation, and the earth held the steady warmth that could outlast any storm. The legacy of the Vogel Bluff House is a powerful reminder of how easily we can mistake the simple for the primitive. The settlers, with their log-building technology, saw Anja's earthen home as a step backward, a regression to something animalistic. They failed to see the sophisticated engineering at its core, a design that anticipated the modern principles of passive solar heating and earth-sheltered construction by a century. They saw a lack of walls. She saw an alliance with the landscape. They saw a primitive burrow. She had engineered a thermal battery. The frontier didn't reward tradition or stubborn pride. It rewarded what worked. And in the crucible of that terrible winter, Anja Vogel's quiet wisdom proved to be the most resilient technology of all. The prairie taught a hard lesson, one that echoes down to us today. True strength isn't always found in standing against the storm, but in knowing when to bow to the earth. If these stories of forgotten ingenuity resonate with you, consider subscribing and joining our community of learners. And let us know in the comments, what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? We read everyone. Disclaimer. This story is a fictionalized reconstruction inspired by historical accounts of earth-sheltered dwellings built by pioneers. The characters and specific events are created for narrative purposes, but the engineering principles of thermal mass, insulation, and passive solar design are real. Always follow modern building codes and consult with professionals for any construction.